Okay, good morning. This is APWC's Hot Topic, and today we have board certified attorney Karen Ensley joining us from Ensley Benitez Law, and she is going to talk to us about employment gone wrong. So welcome, Karen. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. This is one of my many favorite topics to talk about. So I think of all the aspects of managing a business, I think managing people is the hardest by far. Getting the right person, utilizing them correctly, and then knowing what to do when there's a problem. That's always the challenge, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have 10 scenarios that we may get all the way through or we may not. But I am happy if anybody has a comment or a question. Won't bother me to interrupt, just shout out, or I'm not very good at chat, but anyway, let's get started. So as soon as I figure out how to do that, tab. Okay, scenario one. Your crew's working out of town. An employee rifles through another employee's belongings, finds a gay porn magazine, and starts running up and down the hallway of the hotel yelling, "Fred is a faggot." So, by the way, all of these scenarios actually are true, and they've happened to my clients, and we've had counseling about these issues. So here are your options. Do nothing, let the guys work it out for themselves, which a lot of my clients would choose. That's not a good option. Tell Fred to stop being a sissy. That's not a good option. Tell Fred to stop being a sissy, but ask Sissy to ask the guys to stop harassing him. Better, right? Tell Fred you don't know what happened, but we'll speak with the crew chief and get back to him with a response. Initiate a formal investigation and move Fred to another crew. So employees have the right not to be harassed about their personal choices. If it's not work related, it shouldn't come up at work. And just because a crew is out of town and just because they're on their off hours does not mean that the employer would not be in trouble if Fred were to bring a lawsuit, which he could, for harassment. He could certainly sue the individual who was yelling, but he would always sue the employer, and he would have a cause of action because he has a right to a safe workplace. And that includes out of town, and that includes after hours when the employer is providing the housing. So obviously, training didn't happen before they left town. It needs to happen now. And if Fred wants to get moved, he should get moved. And certainly the employee that was acting badly needs to get written up. And the crew chief needs to get written up, because it's the crew chief's obligation to make sure that these guys can work without being harassed. So that's number one. Number two, employee goes out on leave due to a medical condition unrelated to work. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had this conversation. 16 weeks later, he wants to come back to work, but because of performance issues, you don't want him back. Now what do? You have an underperforming employee, and for whatever reason, he leaves and he wants to come back, or she. Do you tell him work is slow right now and you just don't have a place for him, and you hope he goes away and he finds another job? A lot of my clients would do that. Do you tell him his performance prior to his leave was poor and you cannot rehire him? That's actually not a terrible choice, provided you have documented the poor performance. If you have documented the poor performance, then he's still going to claim that the termination was due to a medical condition. And especially in this scenario, it's unrelated to work, but it's especially dangerous to do this when someone's gone out on a workers' comp claim. And then when they come back, you terminate them. Legitimately, they're going to say you terminated them for making a workers' comp claim, and it's really going to be problematic. You tell him he's too much of a liability to bring back to work. You can't do that without a doctor's note, and he shouldn't come back without a doctor's note, obviously. But if he gets a clearance with a doctor's note, or he gets clearance for light duty, you have to give him light duty if you have light duty available. Some of my clients will just ignore his calls, hoping he'll go away on his own. Or you bring him back, but you closely document any further performance issues. And that's really the safest bet, depending on just how bad his performance issues are. If you can live with them until you get them documented and do a proper termination, that's the best scenario. So, but lying about it and telling him work is slow when you're continuing to hire other people, that just opens you up for tremendous liability. Not a good idea. Ignoring his calls, not a good idea. Don't do that. So we're out of town again on scenario 3. I actually litigated this in federal court about 4 years ago. The employee tells the supervisor he cannot work Saturday. This is an accelerated job, and they've got the guys working literally 6.5 days a week trying to get this job done. The guy says he can't work on Saturday. He leaves the job Friday without permission. He's terminated for a no-show, but then he shows up Monday at the main office and he, wants to get put on another crew. So the employer says, well, I can't put you on another crew until you assign this written warning. And the employee says, no, I don't want to sign the written warning because I don't agree with what the written warning said. So do you terminate him for not working on Saturday? Do you give him 3 days off without pay, but let him come back and work the out-of-town job or move to an in-town job? Do you tell him that until he signs the written warning, he will not be reassigned? Do you move him to another crew, assuming one is available? So the backstory is the employee is complaining that the supervisor on site doesn't like him and is targeting him and has demoted him from a forklift driver to a floor worker. And that's the reason why he left. So, these things get messy really quick. They just always do. And what my client did was they refused to put him back on a crew until he signed the written warning. So instead of signing the written warning, he went down and filed a lawsuit with the plaintiff's attorney. And about $100,000 later in legal fees, we won the fight, but we lost the war. It ended up that the judge ruled that he had not been terminated because the written warning clearly said you're not being terminated, you're just being written up. But he was able to prove that he had about 8 hours of unpaid overtime. And anytime you're fighting an FLSA claim, if the employee recovers any money at all, he gets all of his attorney's fees. So these kinds of lawsuits can be really, really difficult. And that's why it's so important to handle these terminations correctly. My suggestion post all of this happening was write the guy up. Don't make him sign the written warning, just write him up, put him in his file, and ask him if he wants to go move to another crew. And then if he refuses to move to another crew or he refuses to go back out to the job site, the out-of-town job, then he has quit instead of being terminated. Now that won't keep him from suing for unpaid overtime. It won't keep him from suing for a wrongful demotion, which is what he was claiming. But it gives him an out. It gives him the ability to save face. And it maybe saves an employee. And in these days, nobody wants to lose an employee if they can avoid it because man, the market's tight. So that's scenario 3. How not to lose an employee and cost yourself a lawsuit. So here's scenario 4. Project foreman has an on-site trailer and an admin working in the trailer. Foreman makes sexually based comments to the admin, frequently bumping up against her, touching her shoulder, etc. Takes her to lunch at a gentleman's club, along with a group of male senior crew members. Do you tell the admin to stop complaining because she got a free lunch? Do you tell the admin if she didn't go to lunch, all she had to do was say no? Do you write up the foreman for inappropriate behavior, provide additional training to all supervisor level employees? Do you put the admin and the foreman in a room together and have them talk it out? So obviously, and it doesn't matter who the he is, it doesn't matter who the she is, it doesn't matter if same sex, opposite sex, none of that matters. A person should be able to work without being sexually harassed. And I'll just mention as an aside, I got a call about a month ago from another client who had a female supervisor who showed up at a male subordinate's home and said that if he would not give her sexual favors, she was going to have him fired. So I mean, this kind of thing just happens all the time. So the first thing I asked my client was, so that you fired the foreman, right? He says, well, no, he's a really key employee. And I said, well, he should have been fired because a supervisor should know better. At the very minimum, he should be written up and additional training should be provided. The putting the admin and the foreman in a room together and having them talk it out is ridiculous. That's just super inappropriate. Although I have seen that happen, and telling the admin she didn't have to go to lunch if she didn't want to, that's obviously not realistic. So making sure that you have a process whereby people can report this kind of behavior in a safe way. They have someone that they can talk to besides their immediate supervisor, because in this case, the admin's immediate supervisor was the project foreman. So reporting something to him is useless. He's the bad guy. So letting your people know that no matter what the issue is, there's someone they can come and talk to. An investigation will be conducted, because you can't necessarily take the admin's word for it either. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Maybe she's the one who initiated, you know, the sexual behavior. So an investigation that's properly documented, that's kept appropriately confidential so that only need to know people are involved, super important. And then if you have a finding that the foreman did in fact act inappropriately, then at the very minimum, he gets written up, depending on whether there's been, depending on how bad the behavior is, depending on whether it's happened before, then it's either something you would terminate for, or it's something that you would just monitor and do additional training on. So talking about sex, scenario 5, your receptionist likes to send sexually based joke emails to the entire office and talk about her weekend exploits with anyone who will listen. And this is actually a pretty common phenomenon too, that I've seen over the years. And employees will think that, and office managers and owners will think it's okay because everyone's okay with it and it's not offending anybody, so it's okay, only it's not. So right there, that's a problem. She should have been written up. She should have been counseled. You know, something should have happened in the office to stop that behavior. It's inappropriate, it's detrimental, and it takes the eye off the ball of, you know, let's focus on getting the work done in a pleasant atmosphere. So the receptionist gets a better job, abandons, and when the new job fizzles out, she comes back only to find someone else in her chair. She sues, claiming she was sexually harassed and then terminated for complaining. How best could you have avoided this lawsuit? Certainly, if you have more than one person working in the office, you need some sort of a published written policy about what is and is not acceptable behavior in the workplace. And really, not just because they're sexually based, but, you know, the tendency to want to send out joke emails, even if they're just funny, even if everybody thinks they're funny, it is takes away from work productivity. And you don't really know what someone thinks is funny and what someone doesn't think is funny. So certainly a written policy prohibiting that, what people want to do in their off time, what people want to do on their lunch break. They really do have a lot more latitude then, even if they're using a work computer. I don't get super militant about the whole using the work computer for personal things, as long as it doesn't result in a virus on the computer. So certainly having a published policy, having a no call, no show policy, and documenting the receptionist violation. The day that she abandoned, or the next day that she abandoned, she should have gotten something sent to her via email with a delivery receipt and certified mail saying, you know, you're no call, no show, you're terminated, and citing the reasons for the termination. And then, you know, another option is to write her up, but bring her back on the payroll. If you haven't documented the bad behavior, and if you don't have a policy prohibiting the behavior that she exhibited, it's much riskier to take a hard line with someone like this. If she wants to come back and you guys can work something out and there's another place for her, maybe, maybe not. That's a judgment call, and that's a tough one. But really the way to avoid the whole issue is to have processes in place that you can manage too. Because one of the things you'll always hear me talk about if we ever talk about employment issues is have a policy that you can manage too. It doesn't want to be, you don't want it so strict that it manages you, but you know, strong fences make good neighbors, and that's true in the employment environment as well. So scenario 6, and this really did happen, honestly. Your accountant has been depositing customer checks into her own personal account, and you didn't find out until you started sending out late notices, and then you got angry customer calls saying they'd already paid. So unfortunately, this gal had been with the company almost 10 years, and it was a small office, and there was too much sharing going on in the office, and the owners were afraid to fire her because she had too much dirt on them. So what do? Do you fire her anyway? Do you fire her and have her criminally prosecuted? Do you move her to another position? Do you pay her to go away and keep her mouth shut? So I'm just curious, which of these would you guys do?
I say fire her and have her prosecuted. She was stealing.
That's my vote too. And then you deal with the repercussion of the fallout of whatever dirt she has.
Yeah. Yeah, that was my vote too. They actually moved her to another position, believe it or not, and kept her. She eventually it was a demotion, you know, of course. And eventually the hard feelings were so bad that they ended up terminating her. But yeah, for sure, firing her and having her criminally prosecuted would have been my choice, in part because, especially if you have a large operation, and obviously you're not going to have it, you know, you're not going to have 25 accountants working for you, but it's important that your employees understand and know that bad behavior will not be tolerated. And you're sending a message, not just to this, you know, you're not really sending a message to a person when you fire them and have them criminally prosecuted, but you want the rest of your team to know that you expect proper behavior. And if you don't get proper behavior, there will be repercussions. So I think it's important for many reasons why you'd want to fire this gal, to say nothing of your customers. So, okay. Scenario 7. This one's a little trickier. After a company sponsored sporting event, your employee shows up the next day reeking of alcohol and still clearly feeling the effects of the previous night's revelry. So what was especially troubling about this call that I got was the individual had a client meeting the next day, and he showed up at the client meeting still somewhat inebriated and smelling of alcohol. So the client calls me and he wants to know what he should do. And actually, my client's choice was to feel bad and do nothing, since the client was the one who had bought the alcohol. And so I said, no, not really. It's not your fault that your employee, anyway, that is not the answer. So do you fire him on the spot? Do you send him home with a written warning? Now you can send him home with a written warning, but if he's still inebriated and you put him in a car, then you have then you have liability. If something were to happen to him, if he were to have an accident and someone were to be injured, you'd have liability for that. So do you write him up and make sure he gets a ride home? That was my suggestion. And along with that, certainly you want to review his employment jacket to see if this is an isolated incident, because if it isn't, maybe you revert back to option one, which is to fire him on the spot. So this is especially important when you have someone who is interfacing with your clients. They have to represent the company in a professional way, clearly showing up smelling of alcohol and still being under the influence does not meet that goal.
Karen, question on that.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't reeking of alcohol somewhat subjective? So is it an option to send them for a blood alcohol test?
So if you have a policy that allows you to make somebody go have a blood alcohol test, you can.
For reasonable cause or something, or reasonable suspicion?
A lot of my clients have employee manuals that say, I can randomly have you tested. I can have you tested for cause. It's a little bit dangerous if in these situations, if you have him tested, because if you have him tested and you find out he's under the influence, and then he's been driving a company vehicle or anything along that line, you can end up creating evidence for a plaintiff's attorney that ends up suing you later because he then got in an accident. So it's like I have a lot of clients who have monitors on their company vehicles that check for speeding or for just all kinds of things, or they have the GPS and it monitors all the time. Well, if you are monitoring a company vehicle and you find out that company vehicle has been in front of a liquor store for the last 2 hours, or it's been at the racetrack, or what I'm saying, in some scenarios, it's good to have that information. It's good to know that he's under the influence, but sometimes you end up creating evidence that you don't really necessarily want to document. And unless you have a policy that allows you to do it, you can't really force them. And for me, it's not necessarily whether he is still under the influence. For me, it's just showing up smelling of alcohol and not being tip top and then interfacing with the client. To me, that's the issue. Certainly you could. Is there anything else that I left out that you guys think you might do instead? Have you ever had this happen before, anybody? No, lucky you.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
That means you're managing your people correctly. So that's good. But certainly you would want to, at the minimum, you would want to write him up, make sure he gets home safely. You want to get that behavior in his employment jacket. And, and sometimes you want kind of a buddy system. You may want a supervisor to maybe just keep an eye on the guy and see how he's doing, see how his performance is, see if it ends up that he really does appear to have a drinking problem. Because in order to show up the next day reeking of alcohol and still feeling the effects, that takes a lot of drinking. And it's entirely possible that all of the drinking didn't stop after he left the event. So those are the kind of things that you need to monitor, because if he gets in an accident in a company vehicle, or even if he's in his own vehicle and he's on company time or conducting company business, the company's liable. And that's a huge liability. Those are huge, really messy, expensive lawsuits.
Karen,
right.
sorry, one more question on that. So
Yeah.
with the company event the night before, is, having them sign a waiver or limiting the number of drinks they have that the company purchases? What are the recommendations there?
Or, yeah, actually, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a lot, there are a lot of events that we go to, that some of them are company sponsored, some of them are association sponsored. Having a waiver signed is always the first thing that you should do. And then limiting the amount of alcohol that's provided by the employer is a really great idea. Oftentimes you'll see everybody gets 2 tickets or whatever, and they can do whatever they want with those 2 tickets. And then after that, if they want to buy more alcohol, then that's their decision. And of course, whoever is serving has liability for over serving. But I had a client who had a Christmas party a couple years ago, and literally they rented out a bar. And it was free drinks as much as you wanted. And that was interesting as the evening wore on. But the waiver that we prepared and that everybody signed also said, if you don't feel like you can drive, we'll provide you an Uber for free. And that was not a bad decision. Really, if you're going to have any significant amount of drinking, somebody who's not drinking should really take all the keys, or someone should be responsible for making sure that nobody decides they can drive home when they really can't. Because anytime an employer is sponsoring an event that has alcohol associated, there's just a hugely heightened exposure to liability. So, but yeah, waivers are great and really important. And a lot of times, for events, when you sign up and you click a box that says, I understand that I am waiving. So you can have it actually signed at the event. You can have it signed before the event, or you can build that into an acceptance of an invite. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But I agree, that would have been the first thing that should have happened before the event ever took place, for sure. Yeah, thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Okay, so number 8, this just happened. One of your outside sales team has an owner unexpectedly terminate a contract he thought was his. And the salesperson decides to retaliate by posting negative, nasty comments about the owner in social media. And this was an owner who has political aspirations in the community and is well known. So do you insist he takes down the post if he wants to keep his job? Make him publicly apologize, write him up, and tell him if he does it again, he'll be terminated? Do you immediately terminate? And then, what do you do? What do you do to save yourself from getting sued by the owner, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. So I get the call and I said, well, you fired him, right? And they said, well, we really didn't know what to do. We didn't know if we should write him up. And I said, well, some behavior is so egregious that you don't have to have, 3 warnings first. And this is that kind of behavior. This is obviously hugely detrimental to the business. And so the outside salesperson was terminated immediately. And because you can't make somebody apologize. I mean, somebody like this is not going to apologize, and you can't make somebody apologize. It would have been great if he had, but what we had to do was my client had to publicly apologize. And that was painful, right? So my client had to publicly apologize and post something in social media saying we regret, you as the company don't necessarily want to assume liability in writing in public on a publicly posted comment that you're responsible for this employee's bad behavior, even though you are. But, we regret that this former employee took this unfortunate action. We certainly don't support it. And, as far as we know, this gal is a great gal, et cetera, et cetera. So we did some of that. And it helped calm the waters there. But now, of course, there's public postings by my client with their name all over it, having to apologize for ridiculous behavior. So it makes my client look bad. Then kind of the other twist, scenario 8.5, the defaming employee supervisor was trying to defend the employee for the posting and wanted to blame the customer for being difficult and that she only got what she deserved. So now this is a little trickier. What would you guys do with that employee supervisor if that was the mindset? Anybody?
I think it depends if you've had other, issues with that employee, but assuming you have not, then potentially it's a conversation or coaching and documenting it.
Right. And that's the conversation that we had. I said, it troubles me that a supervisor would think that behavior was ever okay and would try to excuse it because it isn't ever okay. It's fine to be angry. It's fine to blow off steam internally. It's not fine to make a public posting. So what I recommended was, the supervisor always obviously needs some additional training about what it means to be a supervisor and what it means to be an ambassador of the company. And if the training resolves the issue, that's great. You've saved a supervisor. If not, maybe this person's not ready to be a supervisor. Maybe he or she needs to go back to being, a frontline person, so to speak. So yeah, it was an interesting couple of days for my client. Really, really stressful and unnecessary. And really, it does point out that training should have occurred a lot sooner than this, all across the company, about what is and isn't appropriate when you are representing the company, what kinds of behavior that you can take, how significant it is to post. Not a lot of companies have it still, but every company, I think, should have a social media policy and should train to that, because perhaps that would have saved the situation. Okay, so here's scenario 9. And this is a little tricky too, I think. You just discovered your best foreman failed to disclose on his job application he had a felony conviction from 15 years ago for involuntary manslaughter. What do? Do you immediately fire him? Now, a lot of times, not disclosing something or misrepresenting something in a job application is cause for termination. But felonies that are more than 10 years old, they're not discoverable in litigation. And honestly, I believe that asking that question on a job application is improper anyway. If it's not job related, then it shouldn't be part of a job application. So I think if you have questions like that on your job applications, you need to think seriously about that. So option 1, do you fire him? Do you send out a company-wide email letting other employees know what happened, warning them? Do you put a note in his file, ensure he's restricted from badged projects? Do you ask the rest of the crew if they still want to work for him? So I'm not a big fan of immediately firing somebody in a situation like this, at a minimum, this is a conversation. What happened? You know, was it a bar fight? You know, did somebody get hit too hard? Was it an accident, a vehicle? You know, I mean, what was it? Is the guy a really bad guy? Has he been in trouble since? What's his work record like? All of those things go into that analysis. So obviously you don't send out a company-wide email letting other employees know what happened. I will tell you, I had a client, it was several years ago, who let a key employee go for cause. And then because this was a supervisory level employee that everybody knew, my client called a meeting of the entire company and explained to everybody what happened so they would know. Well, that's really bad. You should never do that. That's confidential information. It could be considered to be slander or libel, and you just never do that. Do you put a note in his file and ensure he's restricted from badged projects? You may need to do that depending on if you're working on schools or whatever, you know, different, your clients will have different requirements for who can be on a job site and who can't be. So certainly that is something, once you become aware of it, that you need to manage to. And then do you ask the rest of the crew if they still want to work for him? And I say no to that. It's nobody's business but the employees what his past is, unless it has anything to do with his current job duties. And it really shouldn't. So it's really, nobody needs to know that. So that's scenario 9. Now here's scenario 9.5. What do you do when it's not a felony conviction for involuntary manslaughter, but he's required to register as a pedophile? Now what do you do? What would y'all do?
Well, I think then there's maybe restrictions on where he could go. Like you mentioned schools. So I think you probably couldn't work in a school or be around children. I'm not sure what all those legalities are, but that seems like it would come up that there's maybe some parts of the job that this person wouldn't be able to do because of the conviction.
Right. You know, it's interesting because my husband's a polygraph examiner and he does a lot of polygraphs on registered sex offenders. And there's a wide range of things that can happen to a person that results in having to register as a sex offender. Really, pedophile is a terrible word to use, but you know, as a registered sex offender, was this a situation where it was an 18-year-old guy dating a gal who was 14 and they ended up getting married when she turned 16, right? Well, that's not bad. I mean, it's a little bit bad, but you know, that's not terrible. You know, was it some really egregious behavior that happened that should never have happened? You know, so depending on the circumstances, always these things should start with a conversation. You know, can you tell me what happened? The person doesn't have to tell you what happened. But if they don't tell you what happened, then your options are certainly limited, very limited. And like Penny said, certainly at the very minimum, anyone who's registered as a sex offender is very unlikely to be allowed to work at schools, probably libraries, city projects of any kind, churches. You wouldn't want that person anywhere where there's a potential for liability to the company or, you know, damage to anybody. It's not really just about liability, right? You don't want to put that person in a situation where there may be reoffending. You don't want to open yourself up to liability. You don't want to expose anybody to potential harm on the outside. So these things always start with a conversation, and then it's a judgment call, really. And most of the time, if you treat your employees like regular human beings, and you try to help them and you try to be sympathetic when you can, most of the time you can work through these things and figure out a way. Sometimes you can't. And if you can't, then you have to separate in as positive a way as you possibly can. And that's not always easy, as I'm sure you all know. Okay, scenario 10. This cracks me up a little bit, actually. So, following a regular weekly meeting, the head of production gets in an argument with the head of sales, and a fist fight breaks out in the stairwell. This actually happened. I'm serious. Grown-ass men. So, both of the employees are injured and required minor medical assistance. They had to go to, one of those little doc in a box things. So then the client wants to know, what do I do? And I said, first off, were you there? So he says he's not there, because I'm like, seriously. Anyway, so he says, I want to fire Bob because, he wanted to fire Bill because he didn't like Bill, and Bill had been a problem for a long time. I said, well, who initiated the argument? And really, I guess they just never have gotten along. So you can fire Bob because he threw the first punch. You can fire Bill because he's been a bad apple for a long time. You can write them both up. He was going to tell them to stop acting like a couple of kids and figure out a way to work together. I've actually had clients that this is how they manage. Two employees aren't getting along. They need to go have a beer or whatever and work it out. Or say nothing and hope it goes away. And I certainly have clients that's how they manage their business too. So saying nothing and hoping it goes away is not the answer. It's never the answer. Tell them to stop acting like a couple of kids and figure it out. Depending on the level of disagreement and the dynamic between them, sometimes sometimes you can do that. Certainly at a minimum, they should both be written up. But because the behavior is so unprofessional, because they are manager level people, their behavior has a huge effect on the people that they manage, and just allowing this kind of behavior to go unanswered is really difficult. My client was set on firing Bill. I said, well, you can't really fire Bill unless you fire Bob, because they were both fighting. So you're going to fire them both, or you're not going to fire either one of them, because one really important precept of managing people is you treat similarly situated people similarly. They're both managers. They were both in the fight. Unless one of them, came up behind the other one and cold cocked them or whatever, whatever. Unless there's something really inequitable about how this whole thing occurred and what the behavior was, you either write them both up or you fire them both. And so in this instance, my client elected to fire them both. And so we talked about the potential liability for firing somebody who's been, popped in the mouth by another employee. Could he claim that he was in an unsafe working environment and that through no fault of his own, he was attacked, and that instead of firing him, the employer should have protected him? That certainly can happen. My client was willing to take that risk because he really, really wanted to get rid of the one guy. So he chose, option whatever to fire them both. Then I get a call a couple days later, because the doc in the box recommended that Bill receive an 8-week treatment for a sore back. Now you fired him. The question is, do you owe Bill 8 weeks of medical treatment when he's fired? And my answer was yes, because at the time that the injury occurred, he was an employee. And because he was an employee at the time the injury occurred, the employer has an obligation to provide medical care. And that obligation doesn't stop with the employment. So that was my recommendation. Fortunately, as far as I know, neither Bill or Bob have taken any action against my client. But crazy things happen all the time when you're managing people. And it's not always easy to know what to do. It just isn't. And you can't have an employment manual for every single scenario that's going to come up. You have to just have to really be involved in the management of the company. You have to know that the managers who are managing the people have the training that they need. And then you've got to manage your managers and hope you can avoid as much liability as you possibly can. So, so really that's it. Those are my 10 scenarios, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Happy to take any comments.
This is Erin. I have a question about that last scenario and the general principle about treating similarly or similar positions the same. What if the employer had very good documentation about Bill showing the bad behavior or the bad apple? In that case, would they be safer in being able to terminate Bill, but not the other guy, if the other guy had no prior incidents and was a good performer?
You know, I'm going to say yes, because if Bob made a mistake and got involved in something and just, you know, got over his skis, so to speak, but he was otherwise a good employee, but Bill is obviously a problem and an instigator, and there's documentation is the key. So in that case, are they really similarly situated? They are as far as their job duties, but maybe they aren't, and you can make that argument that they aren't as far as their performance as an employee. And anytime you have repeat offenders, that does allow you to terminate the one, write up the other, do counseling, and do monitoring. So I think you're right.
Well, and I think from all your scenarios, I mean, this was excellent presentation. All the scenarios really go back to what you were saying about having good documentation before and having the policies in place, because that just gives the employer so many more choices and flexibility and how to respond. So that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Documentation is the key to really every aspect of your business. And I'm just a huge fan of documentation. As a lawyer, when someone comes to me, the facts are already set, right? Oftentimes there's very little factually that we can do. So my question always is, did you document it? Did you, in an employment situation, do you have an employee folder? Did you document the behavior? Did you counsel the employee? All of that stuff. And if you say, no, they were really bad, but we just didn't get around to it, and I talked to them a couple of times, but I never wrote it down, because contemporaneous documentation is hugely important in this scenario. It's important when you're out at the job site and you want to get paid for a change order. All of that, it's just documentation is so important. And it's especially important, or at least as important, when you're dealing with employees, that you have a policy, you manage to the policy, and when someone's not following the policy, then you document that. So thank you.
Karen, when you say contemporaneous documentation, I mean, is that, they could send an email, let's say, in the field, they could send an email that said, look, I talked to this employee today, had this conversation, this is what happened, is that sufficient if you don't have formal documentation?
So any documentation is better than no documentation. In this instance, when we're talking about managing employees, there's two kinds of documentation. Certainly sending an email, even sending a text. A text is documentation if you don't lose it, right? So a text is actually evidence that you can offer in trial now. So the courts have finally caught up, and they've realized that people, use their phones for everything. So sending an email to the office saying, I had a conversation with, whoever about whatever, sending it to the office so that you've documented, and that's contemporaneous documentation. Sending a text message to the person, if the best you can do is the person that you've counseled, saying, we talked about whatever today, and here's the plan going forward. So there's the documentation that you save in the employee file. There's the documentation that you've communicated in writing to the employee. And you want to keep both of those in a permanent place, and you want to keep them separate from, in a segregated, protected area of your server, because that's super confidential information of somebody and you can't have it open to the rest of the office. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Any other questions for Karen? Okay. Well, I thought that was wonderful, and thank you for your time today. And I should have mentioned that Karen is also a member of APWC and a sponsor this year. So thank you for supporting our organization. And yeah, if you want to end by, letting everybody know all of the services that you offer, I know it's beyond just employment.
Sure. Yeah, we are a full service law firm for folks in the contracting industry. So contracts, I do a lot of contract review, I write contracts, negotiate contracts. Employment issues, we do a lot of collection work, lien and bond claim notices, and lawsuits about all kinds of various things, because unfortunately construction is a litigious business. There's lots of potential areas for failure. And then really one of my passions is just educating my clients, certainly, but not just my clients, but folks in the industry on how they can work smarter and not harder, and how they can help maximize, the financial benefits of being an owner. And so all of that stuff is what I do. And there's a team at the office, and we all work hard to do that together. So it's my pleasure to be here, and please do come to the speed networking on when is that coming up?
Yes, October 20th. So yes, we're still looking for a dinner sponsor, and we have 9 table sponsors left. All the other sponsorship spots have been filled, but even if you're not interested in sponsoring, it's available on our website to sign up and buy a ticket for that on Wednesday, October 20th.
That is really one of the most enjoyable events of the entire year for me is the speed networking. It's super fun. So
yes, and I think this is a great resource for our members. So these hot topics are published or in the process of being published on our website with member only access. So you must be a member of APWC to access it. So thank you again, Karen. Thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
yes, thank you.
you.
Bye.